Chapter 17. It was just as he had last seen it, the great ebon bowl drinking the sunlight and reflecting none back to the eye. He stood among the ruins of the fortress, looking out across the lake, whose motionless waters showed that the giant polyp was now a dispersed cloud of animalcules and no longer an organized sentient being. The robot was still beside him, but of Hilvar there was no sign. He had no time to wonder what that meant, or to worry about his friend's absence, for, almost at once, there occurred something so fantastic that all other thoughts were banished from his mind. The sky began to crack in two. A thin wedge of darkness reached from horizon to zenith and slowly widened, as if night and chaos were breaking in upon the universe. Inexorably, the wedge expanded until it embraced a quarter of the sky. For all his knowledge of the real facts of astronomy, Alvin could not fight against the overwhelming impression that he and his world lay beneath a great blue dome, and that something was now breaking through that dome from outside. The wedge of night had ceased to grow. The powers that had made it were peering down into the toy universe they had discovered, perhaps conferring among themselves as to whether it was worth their attention. Underneath that cosmic scrutiny, Alvin felt no alarm, no terror. He knew that he was face to face with power and wisdom, before which a man might feel awe, but never fear. And now they had decided they would waste some fragments of eternity upon Earth and its people. They were coming through the window they had broken in the sky. Like sparks from some celestial forge, they drifted down to Earth. Thicker and thicker they came, until a waterfall of fire was streaming down from heaven and splashing in pools of liquid light as it reached the ground. Alvin did not need the words that sounded in his ears like a benediction. The great ones have come. The fire reached him, and it did not burn. It was everywhere, filling the great bowl of Shalmirane with its golden glow. As he watched in wonder, Alvin saw that it was not a featureless flood of light, but that it had form and structure. It began to revolve itself into distinct shapes, to gather into separate fiery whirlpools. The whirlpools spun more and more swiftly on their axes, their centers rising to form columns from which Alvin could glimpse mysterious evanescent shapes. From these glowing totem poles came a faint musical note, infinitely distant and hauntingly sweet. The great ones have come. This time, there was a reply. As Alvin heard the words, "The servants of the Master greet you. We have been waiting for your coming." He knew that the barriers were down, and in that moment, Shalmirane and its strange visitors were gone, and he was standing once more before the central computer in the depths of Diaspar. It had all been illusion. No more real than the fantasy world of the sagas in which he had spent so many of the hours of his youth. But how had it been created? Whence had come the strange images he had seen? "It was an unusual problem," said the quiet voice of the central computer. "I knew that the robot must have some visual conception of the great ones in its mind. If I could convince it that the sense impressions it received coincided with that image, the rest would be simple." "And how did you do that?" "Basically, by asking the robot what the great ones were like, and then seizing the pattern it formed in its own thoughts. The pattern was very incomplete, and I had to improvise a good deal. Once or twice, the picture I created started to depart badly from the robot's conception. But when that happened, I could sense the machine's growing perplexity and modify the image before it became suspicious. You will appreciate that I could employ hundreds of circuits where it could employ only one, and switch from one image to the other so quickly that the change could not be perceived. It was a kind of conjuring trick. I was able to saturate the robot's sensory circuits and also to overwhelm its critical faculties. What you saw was only the final, corrected image, the one which best fitted the Master's revelation. It was crude, but it sufficed. The robot was convinced of its genuineness long enough for the block to be lifted, and in that moment, I was able to make complete contact with its mind. It is no longer insane. It will answer any question you wish. Alvin was still in a daze. The afterglow of that spurious apocalypse still burned in his mind, and he did not pretend fully to understand the central computer's explanation. No matter. A miracle of therapy had been accomplished, and the doors of knowledge had been flung open for him to enter. Then he remembered the warning that the central computer had given him, and asked anxiously, "What about the moral objections you had to overriding the Master's orders?" "I have discovered why they were imposed. When you examine his life story in detail, as you can now do, you will see that he claimed to have produced many miracles. His disciples believed him, and their conviction added to his power. But, of course, all those miracles had some simple explanation, when indeed they occurred at all. I find it surprising that otherwise intelligent men should have let themselves be deceived in such a manner." "So, the Master was a fraud?" "No, it is not as simple as that. If he had been a mere impostor, he would never have achieved such success, and his movement would not have lasted so long. He was a good man, and much of what he taught was true and wise. In the end, he believed in his own miracles, but he knew that there was one witness who could refute them. The robot knew all his secrets. It was his mouthpiece and his colleague. Yet if it were ever questioned too closely, it could destroy the foundations of his power. So he ordered it never to reveal its memories until the last day of the universe, when the great ones would come. It is hard to believe that such a mixture of deception and sincerity could exist in the same man, but such was the case." Alvin wondered what the robot felt about this escape from its ancient bondage. It was, surely, a sufficiently complex machine to understand such emotions as resentment. It might be angry with the Master for having enslaved it, and equally angry with Alvin and the central computer for having tricked it back into sanity. The zone of silence had been lifted. There was no further need for secrecy. The moment for which Alvin had been waiting had come at last. He turned to the robot and asked it the question that had haunted him ever since he had heard the story of the Master's saga. And the robot replied. Jesserac and the proctors were still waiting patiently when he rejoined them. At the top of the ramp, before they entered the corridor, Alvin looked back across the cave, and the illusion was stronger than ever. Lying beneath him was a dead city of strange white buildings. A city bleached by a fierce light not meant for human eyes. Dead, it might be, for it had never lived, but it pulsed with energies more potent than any that had ever quickened organic matter. While the world endured, these silent machines would still be here, never turning their minds from the thoughts that men of genius had given them long ago. Though Jesserac tried to question Alvin on the way back to the council chamber, he learned nothing of his talk with the central computer. This was not merely discretion on Alvin's part. He was still too much lost in the wonder of what he had seen, too intoxicated with success for any coherent conversation. Jesserac had to muster what patience he could, and hope that presently Alvin would emerge from his trance. The streets of Diaspar were bathed with a light that seemed pale and wan after the glare of the machine city, but Alvin scarcely saw them. He had no regard for the familiar beauty of the great towers drifting past him, or the curious glances of his fellow citizens. It was strange, he thought, how everything that had happened to him led up to this moment. Since he had met Kedron, events seemed to have moved automatically toward a predetermined goal. The monitors, Lys, Shalmirane. At every stage, he might have turned aside with unseeing eyes. But something had led him on. Was he the maker of his own destiny, or was he especially favored by fate? Perhaps it was merely a matter of probabilities, of the operation of the laws of chance. Any man might have found the path his footsteps had traced, and countless times in the past ages, others must have gone almost as far. Those earlier eunuchs, for example, what had happened to them? Perhaps he was merely the first to be lucky. All the way back through the streets, Alvin was establishing closer and closer rapport with the machine he had released from its age-long thraldom. It had always been able to receive his thoughts, but previously he had never known whether it would obey any orders he gave it. Now, that uncertainty was gone. He could talk to it, as he would to another human being. Though, since he was not alone, he directed it not to use verbal speech, but such simple thought images as he could understand. He sometimes resented the fact that robots could talk freely to one another on the telepathic level, whereas man could not, except in lease. Here was another power that Diaspar had lost, or deliberately set aside. He continued the silent but somewhat one-sided conversation while they were waiting in the anteroom of the council chamber. It was impossible not to compare his present situation with that in lease, when Saranis and her colleagues had tried to bend him to their wills. He hoped that there would be no need for another conflict, but if one should arise, he was now far better prepared for it. His first glance at the faces of the council members told Alvin what their decision had been. He was neither surprised nor particularly disappointed, and he showed none of the emotion the councilors might have expected as he listened to the president's summing up. "Alvin," began the president, "we have considered with great care the situation which your discovery has brought about, and we have reached this unanimous decision. Because no one wishes any change in our way of life, and because only once in many millions of years is anyone born who is capable of leaving Diaspar, even if the means exists, the tunnel system to lease is unnecessary, and may well be a danger. The entrance to the Chamber of the Moving Ways has therefore been sealed. Moreover, since it is possible that there may be other ways of leaving the city, a search will be made of the monitor memory units. That search has already begun. We have also considered what action, if any, need be taken with regard to you. In view of your youth and the peculiar circumstances of your origin, it is felt that you cannot be censured for what you have done. Indeed, by disclosing a potential danger to our way of life, you have done the city a service, and we record our appreciation of that fact." There was a murmur of applause, and expressions of satisfaction spread across the faces of the councilors. A difficult situation had been speedily dealt with. They had avoided the necessity of reprimanding Alvin, and now they could go their ways again, feeling that they, the chief citizens of Diaspar, had done their duty. With reasonably good fortune, it might be centuries before the need arose again. The president looked expectantly at Alvin. Perhaps he hoped that Alvin would reciprocate. And express his appreciation of the council for letting him off so lightly. He was disappointed. "May I ask one question?" said Alvin politely. "Of course." "The central computer, I take it, approved of your action?" "In the ordinary way. This would have been an impertinent question to ask. The council was not supposed to justify its decisions or explain how it had arrived at them. But Alvin himself had been taken into the confidence of the central computer, for some strange reason of its own. He was in a privileged position. The question clearly caused some embarrassment, and the reply came rather reluctantly. Naturally, we consulted with the central computer. It told us to use our own judgment. Alvin had expected as much. The central computer would have been conferring with the council at the same moment as it was talking to him. In the same moment, in fact, as it was attending to a million other tasks in Diaspar. It knew, as did Alvin, that any decision the council now made was of no importance. The future had passed utterly beyond its control at the very moment when, in happy ignorance, it had decided that the crisis had been safely dealt with. Alvin felt no sense of superiority, none of the sweet anticipation of impending triumph, as he looked at these foolish old men who thought themselves the rulers of Diaspar. He had seen the real ruler of the city, and had spoken to it in the grave silence of its brilliant, buried world. That was an encounter which had burned most of the arrogance out of his soul, but enough was left for a final venture that would surpass all that had gone before. As he took leave of the council, he wondered if they were surprised at his quiet acquiescence, his lack of indignation at the closing of the path to Lys. The proctors did not accompany him. He was no longer under observation, at least in so open a manner. Only Jesserac followed him out of the council chamber and into the colored, crowded streets. Well, Alvin, he said, you are on your best behavior, but you cannot deceive me. What are you planning? Alvin smiled. I knew that you would suspect something. If you will come with me, I will show you why the subway to Lys is no longer important. And there is another experiment I want to try. It will not harm you, but you may not like it. Very well. I am still supposed to be your tutor, but it seems that the roles are now reversed. Where are you taking me? We are going to the Tower of Loran, and I am going to show you the world outside Diaspar. Jesserac paled, but he stood his ground. Then, as if not trusting himself with words, he gave a stiff little nod and followed Alvin out onto the smoothly gliding surface of the moving way. Jesserac showed no fear as they walked along the tunnel through which that cold wind blew forever into Diaspar. The tunnel had changed now. The stone grill that had blocked access to the outer world was gone. It served no structural purpose, and the central computer had removed it without comment at Alvin's request. Later, it might instruct the monitors to remember the grill again and bring it back into existence. But for the moment, the tunnel gaped unfenced and unguarded in the sheer outer wall of the city. Not until Jesserac had almost reached the end of the air shaft did he realize that the outer world was now upon him. He looked at the widening circle of sky, and his steps became more and more uncertain, until they finally slowed to a halt. Alvin remembered how Illustra had turned and fled from this same spot, and he wondered if he could induce Jesserac to go any further. I am only asking you to look, he begged, not to leave the city. Surely you can manage that. In Airlie, during his brief stay, Alvin had seen a mother teaching her child to walk. He was irresistibly reminded of this as he coaxed Jesserac along the corridor, making encouraging remarks as his tutor advanced foot by reluctant foot. Jesserac, unlike Kedron, was no coward. He was prepared to fight against his compulsion, but it was a desperate struggle. Alvin was almost as exhausted as the older man by the time he had succeeded in getting Jesserac to a point where he could see the whole, uninterrupted sweep of the desert. Once there, the interest and strange beauty of the scene, so alien to all that Jesserac had ever known in this or any previous existence, seemed to overcome his fears. He was clearly fascinated by the immense vista of the rolling sand dunes and the far-off ancient hills. It was late afternoon, and in a little while, all this land would be visited by the night that never came to Diaspar. I asked you to come here, said Alvin, speaking quickly as if he could hardly control his impatience, because I realize that you have earned more right than anyone to see where my travels have led me. I wanted you to see the desert, and I also want you to be a witness, so that the council will know what I have done. As I told the council, I brought this robot home from Lys in the hope that the central computer would be able to break the block that had been imposed on its memories by the man known as the Master. By a trick which I still don't fully understand, the computer did that. Now I have access to all the memories in this machine, as well as to the special skills that had been designed into it. I'm going to use one of those skills now. Watch. On a soundless order which Jessarak could only guess, the robot floated out of the tunnel entrance, picked up speed, and within seconds was no more than a distant metallic gleam in the sunlight. It was flying low over the desert, across the sand dunes that lay crisscrossed like frozen waves. Jessarak had the unmistakable impression that it was searching, though for what, he could not imagine. Then, abruptly, the glittering speck soared away from the desert and came to rest 1,000 feet above the ground. At the same moment, Alvin gave an explosive sigh of satisfaction and relief. He glanced quickly at Jessarak as if to say, "This is it." At first, not knowing what to expect, Jessarak could see no change. Then, scarcely believing his eyes, he saw that a cloud of dust was slowly rising from the desert. Nothing is more terrible than movement where no movement should ever be again. But Jessarak was beyond surprise or fear as the sand dunes began to slide apart. Beneath the desert, something was stirring like a giant, awakening from its sleep. And presently there came to Jessarak's ears the rumble of falling earth and the shriek of rock split asunder by irresistible force. Then, suddenly, a great geyser of sand erupted hundreds of feet into the air, and the ground was hidden from sight. Slowly, the dust began to settle back into a jagged wound torn across the face of the desert. But Jessarak and Alvin still kept their eyes fixed steadfastly upon the open sky, which, a little while ago, had held only the waiting robot. Now, at last, Jessarak knew why Alvin had seemed so indifferent to the decision of the council, why he had shown no emotion when he was told that the subway to Lys had been closed. The covering of earth and rock could blur, but could not conceal the proud lines of the ship still ascending from the riven desert. As Jessarak watched, it slowly turned toward them until it foreshortened to a circle. Then, very leisurely, the circle started to expand. Alvin began to speak, rather quickly, as if the time were short. This robot was designed to be the master's companion and servant, and, above all, the pilot of his ship. Before he came to Lys, he landed at the port of Diaspar, which now lies out there beneath those sands. Even in his day, it must have been largely deserted. I think that the master's ship was one of the last ever to reach Earth. He lived for a while in Diaspar before he went to Shalmirane, the way must still have been open in those days. But he never needed the ship again, and all these ages, it has been waiting out there beneath the sands, like Diaspar itself, like this robot. Like everything that the builders of the past considered really important, it was preserved by its own eternity circuits. As long as it had a source of power, it could never wear out or be destroyed. The image carried in its memory cells would never fade, and that image controlled its physical structure. The ship was now very close, as the controlling robot guided it toward the tower. Jessarak could see that it was about 100 feet long and sharply pointed at both ends. There appeared to be no windows or other openings, though the thick layer of earth made it impossible to be certain of this. Suddenly, they were spattered with dirt as a section of the hull opened outward, and Jessarak caught a glimpse of a small bare room with a second door at its far end. The ship was hanging only a foot away from the mouth of the air vent, which it had approached very cautiously, like a sensitive living thing. "Goodbye, Jessarak," said Alvin. "I cannot go back into Diaspar to say farewell to my friends. Please do that for me. I am grateful. Tell Arrestin and Etanya that I hope to return soon. If I do not, I am grateful for all that they did. And I am grateful to you, even though you may not approve of the way I have applied your lessons. And as for the council, tell it that a road that has once been opened cannot be closed again merely by passing a resolution." The ship was now only a dark stain against the sky, and of a sudden, Jessarak lost it altogether. He never saw its goings, but presently There echoed down from the heavens the most awe-inspiring of all the sounds that man had ever made. The long-drawn thunder of air falling, mile after mile, into a tunnel of vacuum drilled suddenly across the sky. Even when the last echoes had died away into the desert, Jesserac never moved. He was thinking of the boy who had gone. For to Jesserac, Alvin would always be a child, the only one to come into Diaspar since the cycle of birth and death had been broken so long ago. Alvin would never grow up. To him, the whole universe was a plaything, a puzzle to be unraveled for his own amusement. In his play, he had now found the ultimate deadly toy which might wreck what was left of human civilization. But whatever the outcome, to him, it would still be a game. The sun was now low on the horizon, and a chill wind was blowing from the desert. But Jesserac still waited, conquering his fears. And presently, for the first time in his life, he saw the stars.